joined IBP in 2021 as our Southwest avian ecologist and led IBP's work with the National Park Service to develop a bird monitoring plan for the national parks and the Southern Colorado Plateau Regional Monitoring Network. He currently leads our monitoring work for 6 parks in this network and is helping organize inventory work for yellow-billed cuckoo and pinyon jays in the Colorado Plateau parks. Harry received his PhD in zoology from the University of Florida and has conducted bird research throughout the Americas, from Michigan to the Colombian Andes, where he did the research for his dissertation that he will be discussing with us today. He is particularly interested in how human-caused change in the environment affects bird communities, populations, and behaviors.
So yeah, this is kind of an interesting presentation because it's bringing together 2 worlds, or like 2 parts of my life. One, the IBP half, and so thanks IBP for letting me share some of the results from this research that was conducted in Colombia, and definitely not in the southwestern United States. And then the PhD side, and so I'm going to talk today a little bit about how bird communities in tropical cloud forests in the Andes respond to forest fragmentation. And obviously, any big project like this wouldn't be possible without a lot of collaborators. So while there's my name that you see up here, there's innumerable other people who helped, including many wonderful collaborators in Colombia. So I'm going to try and call out a lot of them throughout the talk, and at the end, but just know that there are a lot of people's very hard work went into this. And so what are we going to talk about today? Well, I just want to briefly bring everyone up to speed on what forest fragmentation is, discuss a little bit the study system that I was working in Colombia in the Western Andes. And then there's going to be 2 kind of major halves to this talk. The first is how are bird communities affected by fragmentation? And then, so we're going to look at patterns of how communities are changing. And the second is why bird communities are changing. So trying to understand the mechanisms by which we're losing birds in forest fragments. So hopefully one flows logically into the other, but more so I hope. But I just kind of wanted to start with the concept of biodiversity loss and forest fragmentation. So people have talked of a 6th mass extinction to go with the 5 through Earth's history. But what's certain is that there's a lot of defaunation. There's reducing abundances of wildlife, including birds. And one major driver of this is forest loss, particularly in the tropics. But of course, forest isn't lost in big chunks. Typically, often you have forest loss that's accompanied with forest fragmentation. So if we can imagine, we start with an area of forest that then gets eaten into, and we end up with smaller and smaller patches that end up being more and more isolated. And so that's this concept of forest fragmentation. There was this really interesting study conducted in 2015 that found that about 70% of the world's forests are within 1 kilometer of an edge. And it's only in major lowland rainforests of the Congo Basin and the Amazon Basin that we don't see fragmentation of some type. So it's really a pervasive problem, but it's an especially pervasive problem in the tropics because the tropics house the majority of the world's biodiversity. And fragmentation has a lot of effects on organisms that function in a lot of different ways. So the simplest way to look at it is there's a patch size, an amount of, in this case, forest that's remaining. And we expect that as the size of the patch gets smaller, the amount of biodiversity, the number of species or birds or whatever that are in it is going to decrease. So that's sort of at a patch scale. Then within the patch, there's also other effects of fragmentation. So one is edge effects. So we know that the edge of a forest, especially if that forest is surrounded by something like cattle pasture or open grassland, there's a huge transition zone. And so conditions, both biological and not biological, things like light, temperature, humidity, are different around the edge of this forest patch compared to the interior. And when we fragment forests anywhere, but especially in the tropics, that actually opens up access to human beings. And so it's easier to get to these forest patches and easier to exploit them. So to remove, in Colombia, there's quite a bit of selective logging, which is not clear cutting, but it's going in to a patch and removing specific trees that are large and of sort of timber quality trees. And this has an overall effect of reducing the canopy. It creates these big gaps in the canopy, and it's actually reducing the amount of vegetation structure in the forest. In other words, how much vegetation is there at different heights between the canopy and the ground. So all this has important effects on tropical birds, as we will soon discover. But one of the main questions from this work was, which of these mechanisms is the most important? We're trying to understand, what is it about fragmentation that's particularly bad or good for bird communities? And then we also are interested in, how are we losing biodiversity? And so we get to this concept of beta diversity. And beta diversity is basically how much is a bird community or any community changing from location A to location B. So the first concept is that of nestedness. And if you look up here in A, if we imagine that each of these sites is a different fragment, a nested pattern of species loss would mean that, for example, as we get into smaller and smaller fragments, we start losing species in a very predictable manner. So that would mean both small fragments, or medium fragments at least, contain some forest birds, which would be good, and that species richness, if we just count the number of birds species, is a pretty good measure of how well we're doing in terms of conserving. But it's not that simple. If you look at case B here, we can also have species turnover. And so in this case, if we start from a continuous forest site and go to, say, a small fragment, we actually don't have a change in the number of species, but we do have a change in the types of species, the species composition. So we're replacing forest birds with non-forest birds. And in this case, species richness is not really telling you anything about how well you're conserving forest birds. It also means that in small fragments, you just don't have very many forest birds left. So they're not effectively conserving the forest birds. And of course, in reality, there's kind of a mix of the two. It's kind of case C all the time. And so there's statistical ways we can pull apart those two processes and try and get at what percentage is explained by nestedness and what percentage is explained by turnover. And then a last concept, I'm kind of throwing a lot at you here, but is functional diversity. And a good way of thinking about that is that's the diversity of what organisms do, right? How do they interact with their environment? And obviously birds interact with their environment in a tremendous variety of ways. If you think about pollination, like a hummingbird, seed dispersal, they're predators of insects, of all kinds of things, rodents. And obviously an eagle is not the same as a hummingbird. So one species does not equal to one species in terms of what they do. But even in terms of one hummingbird species is not equal to another hummingbird species, because maybe they specialize on different plant species. And so we're really interested in, as we get changes to the bird community with fragmentation, are we losing some of these functional groups, these groups of functions that birds perform for the ecosystem? So I talk a lot about the tropical Andes, but what are they? Well, it's a very large area, over 300,000 square kilometers, that contains parts of Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia, and small parts of northern Chile and Argentina. And so here we're looking at northern South America, and it basically is a forest type that's found at high elevations in the tropics, and that follows the main spine of the Andes down the length of South America. And this area is a biodiversity hotspot in the sense that not only is habitat being lost, but there's a tremendous amount of biodiversity there to begin with. So these are global maps here of bird richness, how many species are where, and endemism, so species that have very small ranges that are only found in specific countries or sometimes mountain ranges. And it is a center of global bird richness and endemism. If we map it, you can see that the tropical Andes really pop out here as having a lot of bird species. By some estimates, up to 22% of total bird species richness globally. And these birds are particularly at risk because they often inhabit these very small elevational ranges. So they have what's called shoestring ranges that kind of stretch along a very long amount of latitude, but a very small amount of elevation. If you go up slope or down slope 500 meters, you might end up with different bird species. The sad truth is that a lot of the tropical Andes has been deforested. So it's hard to get solid estimates, and there are increasingly good ones with remote sensing. But for example, in Colombia, up to 70% of the forests above 1,000 meters have been lost, the historical distribution. And that's partly because these are some of the most inhabited parts of South America. The capitals of Venezuela, Colombia, and Ecuador are all in the Andes, as are many other large cities. And they're also major areas for agriculture. So there's continuing expanding deforestation, and it's predicted that in Colombia, again, 30% of the current forests may be lost by 2050. And this is just showcasing from a recent really good review paper about tropical cloud forests, but you can see these pie charts here on the left that show the number of bird species associated with different tropical cloud forest ranges. And then here it's showing cloud forest loss within Colombia. These are the three main branches of the Andes in Colombia, and the amount of cloud forest that's been lost in protected and unprotected areas from 2001 to 2018. So it is ongoing, and it's a continuous problem because increasing fragmentation seems to be, in some areas at least, the way of the future. And of course, we have to mention climate change as well, right? So there's been a lot of talk of the escalator to extinction. Species get pushed up the mountainside as climate warms, and these birds do have very specific, or they live in very specific climate zones. So the extent to which their ranges will be changing with future climate change isn't very well known, but it's thought that there is going to be change. So it's another factor in their conservation. Okay. So how are bird communities affected by fragmentation in tropical cloud forests in Colombia? So we had three main questions of interest for this first part. So what are the scales that are driving change? Was a major one. Is it, again, these at the patch scale, the amount of habitat, or is it within the patch? Is it edge effects, or is it these selective logging effects? Second, do taxonomic, in other words, the number of species, and functional diversity, that diversity of what birds do, are they responding similarly to fragmentation? And then third, as I alluded to, what is driving the change across different size fragments? Is it nestedness, or are we seeing lots of species turnover? So this work that I'm going to talk about today was actually conducted in the Western Andes. So there's the Eastern, the Central, and the Western Andes in Colombia. The range kind of splits in three, and it's divided by two river valleys. So we're in the Western Andes, or on the eastern slope of the Western Andes, in a very small town called El Cairo is the municipality. And we were able to find an area that had fragments of different sizes that were also at the same elevation, which is really crucial when you're working in tropical mountains. And so this work was conducted in collaboration with a really wonderful local grassroots NGO called Serraniagua, who've done a lot of work with private reserves there, as well as capacity building of local farmers and local women. A lot of cool work, which I don't have time to talk about, but essentially in this landscape, we selected patches of forest that were surrounded by cattle pasture and that were at about 2,000 meters, so at the same elevation. And we selected 8 sites, 8 fragments that ranged in size from about 10 hectares to about 170 hectares, which is about the full variation in size that we could find in this landscape. Of course, there's also the consideration of can you get there? And that also influenced where we could and couldn't survey. And And then what's also wonderful about this same landscape is that Serraniagua has their own privately managed reserve of over 700 hectares, which is Cerro El Inglés. And so this provides a continuous forest reference site that's in the same landscape that we can compare to. So it's actually connected to thousands of hectares of forest along the Western Andes and down into the Choco on the other side, the Pacific rainforest type. So within these transects, you'll see within these fragments, we established 500-meter long sampling transects, and that is essentially the site for the purpose of this study. I should also add that this is not my landscape. I didn't come up with this. I worked really closely with a good friend and colleague, Juliana Bedoya, who was studying at the University of Florida with me at the same time. And she sort of developed this study system for mammals, and we were able to also work with birds. So it was a really wonderful collaboration. And again, this is just showcasing what this landscape looks like. At the lower elevations, there's a lot of shade coffee plantations. And then when it gets too high to grow coffee, there's these smallholder cattle pastures. So they're pretty much cleared of forest, and they have cows. But we're not talking about massive industrial scale. We're talking about one herd or two. And finally, the forest is typically left on the ridge tops here, often to supply water to the farms below. And this is just to showcase that some of the patches are quite large, but the transition from pasture to forest is pretty stark. And thanks in part to these guys, these cows. So within these forest patches, there's also a lot of variation. And so we have sort of what I'm calling primary forest that is not very logged and is still in a pretty good state of conservation. And so you'll see here very large diameter trees, lots of epiphytes, lianas, tree ferns, and a pretty intact canopy cover. But there's also sites within the same fragment. The fragments were owned by lots of people that you see a sort of regenerating forest, a more secondary forest. And so there were different stages of regeneration, but this is in part due to selective logging practices. So was taken in this landscape where people come in and they, like I said, they cut down one tree and they leave these canopy gaps, and that leads to a secondary forest with much smaller diameter trees. And how did we were really interested in the effects of changes to vegetation structure on bird communities. So within these 500-meter transects that we established, we actually broke them down into 100-meter segments. And then we actually had different measurements of different aspects of vegetation structure. So we looked at canopy height, canopy cover, and vertical vegetation complexity. So just how many layers of vegetation are there, with the idea that more equals better if you're a forest bird. And then we also had these belt surveys. So we actually, they're 3 meters by 100 meters, and we measured the densities of different understory plants. And we also took the diameter at breast height of every tree. So it was a very intensive amount of work, but it allowed us to create these measurements, these multivariate measurements of things like understory plant density and tree size. So that's kind of a way to measure logging history. If there's been more logging, then the diameters of the trees are much smaller. And if it's a more old growth forest, then you have much larger diameters. So we tried to quantify these 3 different aspects of fragmentation effects as best we could. So like I said, we measured a lot of the vegetation effects and successional effects within fragments, but then we also used a buffer analysis. So we were able to quantify the patch area as the percentage forest cover within 1 kilometer. And you might say, well, that's very weird. Why didn't you just take the patch area? That would be much better. And it would, except for when you have a continuous forest site like Cerro El Inglés, there's no patch size. Is it at 700? Is it 1,000? Is it 200,000 hectares? So that's why we opted to go with this. And we also used edge effects, quantified edge effects using edge density. So what is that? We look at this buffer around our transect, and then we say, what is the length of forest edge in meters per area? So it's a way of looking at whether there's fewer edges or more forest edges. And then we were measuring a lot of response variables here. So we looked at taxonomic diversity, species richness, how many species are there? We were measuring occupancy, in other words, the probability that a bird species is in one patch or another on one transect. And then we looked at, as I mentioned, beta diversity. How much is the community changing from one transect to another? And we also looked at functional diversity, that diversity of roles that birds play in communities, as well as the beta diversity of functional diversity. And surveying tropical bird communities is not easy. There's a lot of species, and there's really no one best way of doing it. So we decided to combine 3 different survey methods to try and get as many possible species. So again, on these same 500-meter transects, we did transect surveys, which involved walking back and forth all day long with binoculars. And so that was primarily to get these big mixed species flocks. So there's huge mixed species flocks in the Andes, which can have like 20, 30 bird species in them. And a lot of birds are only found in mixed species flocks, so they're not easy to get with point counts. And it also allowed us to get things large-bodied species that are just hard to see, infrequent. We put mist nets on these transects as well, not at the same time as the transects. And we were able to get a lot of understory birds, secretive understory birds, and hummingbirds, which are very hard to ID, just with binoculars. And then lastly, we did playback surveys for owls at the center of these transects at night. So try and get at the owl community that was present. So we tried to be as exhaustive as possible. And to try and model this, we used an occupancy model. And so an occupancy model helps you determine, did we not see the bird because it's not there? Or did we not see the bird just because we missed it? And so what we feed into that is the presence, absence, was it there, was it not there, from all of our different survey types, and then those covariates that I mentioned. And what does this allow us to do? Well, it allows us to get a species-specific response to each covariate. In other words, how does, say, patch size influence the occupancy of species A or species B? And then it also allowed us to calculate how good each of these methods was at detecting every species. So owl playback surveys were very bad at detecting anything that was not an owl, obviously. So it accounts for that in the modeling. And it's a Bayesian model, so I won't go into any of those details, but what can we get out of this? Well, we can actually get at these beta estimates, the effect size for each species. So again, how they're being affected by something like patch size. And then it also can spit out a kind of magical matrix that has whether or not each species is at each site after we've corrected for whether we can detect them. And that's really nice because we can get a whole lot of other metrics from that. We can get at these beta diversity, is nestedness or turnover more important? We can calculate measures of functional diversity, and then we can also just get the estimated species richness. So after controlling for all the birds we missed in our surveys, how many bird species does the model think are in this one patch of cloud forest? All right, that's like as much statistics as I'm going to give you, I promise. So some results. So we broke down the bird community into 3 categories, what we call forest specialists. These are birds that are only found in forests. They like forest interior. So these are the ones we're most worried about with fragmentation. Then we have forest generalists. They like forests, but they also like things like shade coffee plantations, forest edges. They're less picky. And then we have forest visitors, and these are not forest species, but they can invade forests in small patches. They might be birds that like grasslands, they like cattle pastures, but they're not true forest species. All right, so what do we find overall? If we look at all bird species, the species richness declines with fragment size. But what's really interesting is that you get this big drop off between these continuous forest sites over here and the largest fragment that we surveyed, which is 170 hectares. So from continuous forest to 170 hectares, we've lost 30 bird species already. And what kind of species are they? They're all forest specialist species. So again, this is what we would expect. We see forest visitor richness going up, forest specialist richness going down, and then the generalists, there's a small decline, but there's really not much difference. So again, are birds that do great in shade coffee, so they like small patches. And we also tried to break this down by foraging guilds. And again, as you can see, the major result is that it's insectivores that are really declining very precipitously. Those are the ones we're losing even in these large fragments, 170 hectare fragments, whereas omnivores aren't changing. And if you just look at the richness, the frugivores and the nectarivores, in other words, hummingbirds, that's not changing. Look, it's the same number of species, but I think that's misleading, as we'll see in a second. And finally, the birds of prey, including the forest owls, did decline as well with fragment size. So we definitely have two foraging guilds that are more affected than the others. And this is a large and confusing table, but there's a few things I want to take away from this. So the question is nestedness or turnover more important? And first, overall, this is the dissimilarity between all the sites. So if this were 0, that would mean every site had all the same species. If it's 1, it means that every transect shares no species. And it's really high. So we're already seeing it's almost 0.8. That's very high. And what's explaining this really high dissimilarity? It's turnover, right? So 85% of the dissimilarity is due to turnover, and very little is due to nestedness. So we're just getting completely new bird species in small fragments, which is not really great if you're trying to conserve forest birds. And those frugivores and nectarivores, that the species richness doesn't change, the species composition does change. And here you're seeing about 90% probability, or 90% of the change is due to turnover. So birds that really depend on plants with fruit or flowers have a huge turnover, even higher than other foraging guilds, from continuous forest to small fragments. And we used this analysis, which is an NMDS. So what you need to know about this is that each of these circles represents a transect. And the closer they are in space, the closer the species composition. So these two sites had nearly identical species composition. And these are the two transects that were in continuous forest. And then these ovals here represent different categories of fragment sizes. So you see the large fragments, so these are greater than 100 hectares. In blue here, these are the sites associated, medium and small fragments. And immediately you can see that even the largest fragments that we surveyed have a very different composition, right? These points are very far away from these points. So the bird composition, bird community composition is very different, even in 170 hectare fragments to continuous forest reference sites. These triangles, squares, and circles here actually represent where different bird species were most likely to be found. And you can see that the green triangles are more likely to be found in continuous forests. And there's some that were more likely to be found in large fragments, but medium and small fragments don't have a lot of forest specialist species. So why are we seeing so much change, from this continuous forest site, Cerro del Inglés, to small fragments? Well, I think there's a variety of reasons. One is that these are forest fragments surrounded by cattle pasture. So forest birds don't like to cross non-forest habitat. It's much harder, maybe, for a forest bird to disperse into a small fragment that's surrounded by cattle pasture than if you had a different matrix type. Maybe shade coffee is easier for them to move through. Second, these were sites that were fragmented, we think, a long time ago, at least 50 to 60 years ago. And so there's this concept of the extinction debt. In other words, if I fragment a forest site, there will still be some birds that remain in it, but the habitat is no longer good enough to support them or for them to breed. And over the years, they will start to go extinct from that site until only the species remain that are the ones that are adapted to survive well at that site. And if this had been fragmented 10 years ago, maybe we would see more forest birds, but there's been enough time that a lot of them have died out in sites that are no longer suitable habitat. And then I think there's also just a lot of disturbance pre-adapted species in this landscape. And what do I mean by that? Well, the Andes, unlike, say, the Amazon rainforest, do have a lot of disturbance that's sort of built in the form of landslides. So these are both photos from protected areas in Colombia. In fact, this is from Cerro del Inglés. And you can see here with these steep slopes, there's a lot of rain. You get these huge landslides that essentially take out all vegetation, and you're getting a successional process that's happening. And it's normal that if you have landslides every few years all over the landscape, you kind of get a patch of some old growth forest, some young forest, and you have birds that are adapted to live in regenerating forests within landslides. So I think there's a lot of birds that are adapted to that, and those birds do great in fragments. So they move in and they're very happy. What scales were driving the loss? So remember, we were interested in the patch size, edge effects, and then the vegetation structure, right? And we found that the patch size is very important. So there's 42 significant positive responses, that species that had higher occupancy in larger forest patches. And then also negative responses. So some birds really do like smaller patches. But the edge effects and the selective logging effects were also quite significant. And the edge effects were all negative, while the selective logging effects were also all negative. So forest birds don't like selective logging, and they don't like more forest edge near the transect. And we thought, well, it'd be interesting to look at how these responses are correlated or not, right? In other words, do birds that like bigger fragment sizes, how do they respond to these other factors? So birds that like larger fragments don't like higher edge density. So they tend to not like forest edges. And there's a less strong correlation, but the birds that like larger fragments also liked larger diameter trees, right? So these are forest interior birds. They seem to like old growth forest better, and they don't like edges. So you're kind of seeing a pattern here that fragmentation is mimicking the natural successional gradient in things that like large patches, like late successional, things that like small patches of small fragments, like early successional. And then finally, we're interested in, is functional diversity being lost? And yes, it is, but it's not being lost. It seems like you still maintain a lot of functional diversity in these large patches, 100 hectares, 150 hectares, but below about 100 hectares, the amount of functional diversity starts to drop off very quickly. So even though there's turnover, you're not keeping the same functional groups that you have in continuous forest. And that kind of begs the question of which functional groups are being lost. So we put together a list of functional traits. And we'll talk more about functional traits in the second half of the talk, but essentially ways that birds interact with their environment. And then we actually were able to build, this looks like a phylogeny, but it's not a phylogeny. It's actually a functional grouping, a plot of functional grouping. So what does that mean? Birds that are in a clade here that are grouped together have the same function in the environment. They're ecologically more similar. That might mean they eat the same thing, that they live at the same height in the forest, that they have a similar body size, a similar nest type. So you get the idea. And what we're looking at here is we're actually able to plot the functional groups, and this is the beta, the effect size of forest cover. So the red color indicates species that really like small fragments. And then the yellow or white color indicates species that really like large fragments. So if we break this down a little further, we can see that for some functional groups, we actually have a lot of turnover within the functional group. So something like hummingbirds or understory frugivores, you see some red and you see some yellow. So there's some hummingbirds like small fragments, some hummingbirds like large fragments, which is what we saw. That's why there's really high turnover there. The same is true for canopy frugivores. So birds that are associated with plants had a very high turnover within the functional group. But then there's other functional groups that are just lost entirely in small fragments, right? And that includes, let's see, my computer is being a little, includes large-bodied frugivores, forest owls, some of these mid-story flycatchers, and you're going to see there's a lot of things that, a lot of insectivores that come out, right? Because we show that those are the most sensitive. But so there's some of these clusters I'm trying to put your attention on are ones that just have these yellow or white colors. So these are whole functional groups that are just lost in small fragments. Bamboo specialized insectivores, and then ground and mid-story insectivores, as well as, and this was kind of surprising, a forest swift species, which is tied to large fragments as well. So these are some functional groups that we think are lost and they're not being replaced in small fragments. So a few take-home messages from this first half of the talk. One is that there's a loss of forest specialists, which primarily is made up of insectivores and birds of prey, even in very larger than 100-hectare fragments. The largest fragments in the El Cairo landscape still didn't have 30 of the species from continuous forest. And so large reserves are really required if you're trying to protect the full diversity of birds in Andean cloud forests. Second, this was really a turnover-driven system. So a lot of the birds associated with plants turnover almost completely. You have completely different hummingbirds, completely different fruit-eating birds. And so species richness is not informative at all. You can look at the species richness in a patch, but it's not really telling you which bird species are there. And this turnover doesn't rescue functional diversity. We lose specific functional groups and we don't gain them back. Lastly, fragment species are typically edge adapted and they prefer secondary forests, we think. So there seems to be a very important effect of edge effects on cloud forest birds in particular. And I'm hoping the second half of the talk will explain why that is. And lastly, this is a focal landscape that has been fragmented for a long time and is surrounded by cattle pasture, which is very bad habitat for forest birds. So it's a bit of a worst case scenario, but clearance of cloud forest for cattle ranching is a major source of forest loss in these landscapes. So I think it's not unreasonable to think that this is somewhat representative of how bird communities respond to fragmentation throughout middle elevations in the Colombian Andes. So we have an explanation of some of the patterns, but we were really interested in the mechanisms. Why are we losing birds in small fragments? And I want to go over 4 different mechanisms that we tried to test in a sort of indirect way. So one is changes to food availability. Tropical birds are extremely specialized, to the point where some of them will only forage in dried up dead leaf clusters that are in the subcanopy. I mean, this is the level of specialization. And so when we lose vegetation structure in fragments, they also lose their foraging microhabitat, and they can no longer compete with the other bird species, especially insectivores. But we also lose food plants. We get a turnover in the plant species as well. And if you're a frugivore that depends on a certain genus of understory shrub, maybe that's lost in a fragment, and you've lost your main food source. Second, increased nest predation is possible in fragments. So there's a sort of hypothesis that because you lose the big top alpha predators in fragments, that these mesopredators, things like small mammals or large birds, have much higher densities, and they can eat a lot more bird eggs and lower the nest survival. So any bird that's in a fragment just can't reproduce as effectively. Third, and as I mentioned, is dispersal limitation. If you're trying to go from here to here, you have to cross all this, which is not only not forested, but it's super bright and open. And there might be predators in here that are waiting to eat you. So birds may be unable to fly long distances if they live in the forest, or they may be unwilling because it's a very foreign environment to cross these and colonize new fragments. And lastly, and this is, I think, a more recent hypothesis, but a very interesting one in my opinion, is changes to light intensity. So we know that in fragments, we have more canopy gaps, especially with logging. We have more light, more edges. So more light is coming into the forest understory. And if you're a forest interior bird, you don't very much like light. And so suddenly the microhabitat of light has changed very dramatically. And this really could reduce the habitat quality for forest birds. So again, we wanted to know which of these mechanisms, if any, is explaining why we're losing so many birds in small fragments, particularly the forest birds. And then do they differ across the full community and with just insectivores? So as you all saw, the insectivores are the ones that are really not doing well. So is there something special about insectivores that makes them especially vulnerable? And we can't test these directly, right? I mean, you could, but you would need a long time and a lot of field work. It would be really fun, but we didn't have the data to do that. So we decided we wanted to test this indirectly, and we wanted to use functional traits. So we thought we can find functional traits that are tied to specific mechanisms. And I had a great time working with 2 Colombian colleagues, well, 3 actually, on this, and coming up with different functional traits that might be representative of the different mechanisms. So we were able to get these traits from Cornell's Birds of the World, which isn't perfect, but it does have a lot of natural history information about neotropical birds. So the first thing was diet specialization. So we thought if a bird is more specialized in its diet, it only eats insects, for example, it should be more sensitive if it's losing food resources because it can't adapt, it can't find other sources. So we're actually able to pull out information like that and calculate this coefficient of how specialized the bird's diet is. We also thought if birds in specific foraging strata are more affected by fragmentation, then that might be indicative that there's structural changes happening at one part of the forest, right? So again, would be indicative that where you eat is driving whether you can live in a fragment or not. So we actually were able to measure that indirectly as well. We also thought if you use very specific microhabitats like these really thick clumps of Andean bamboos, the Chustea bamboo, then maybe if you lose those microhabitats, you can't survive in a fragment. So we recorded other species use them. And then for just the insectivores, we thought maybe how you forage. In other words, are you a flycatcher? Do you fly out and eat flying insects, or do you actually forage on the vegetation itself? would have an effect. So all those we made predictions about how loss of food resources should affect those birds with those functional traits. For the changes to light intensity, we looked at relative eye size. So it's been found that the size of a bird's eye correlates with its light environment. So here I've picked out two different species. This is a canopy bird that likes to eat fruit, a Chloriphonia. It has a relatively small eye. But here, this understory species has a relatively large eye. It walks around on the forest understory and hunts for insects. And we can actually measure the eye size, the eye size, but, and we actually were able to pull images from Cornell's Macaulay Library and measure it. But we need to have a way to know, to standardize the measurements, to know how many millimeters this is. And we discovered that bird banders record the height of the bill. And it turns out that a professor at ICESI in Cali, Gustavo Londoño, had just tons and tons and tons of banding data, including the bill height. And so we could use the bill height to standardize this distance in an image from Macaulay and measure the eye size. And what do we get from that? Well, bigger birds have bigger eyes, right? An eagle has a bigger eye than a hummingbird. But what we're really interested in is this bird's eye big for its body size? And so you can actually regress eye size against body size and get the residual. So in other words, how much bigger or smaller is this bird's eye for its body size? So relative eye size. And then dispersal can be measured by measuring the wing. And it's been shown that the shape of the wing is correlated with dispersal ability. And so there's this measurement called the hand wing index, where they actually look at whether the wing is more pointed or more rounded. And I won't go into exactly how it's calculated, other than to say that we know that there's tremendous variability in the shape of bird wings. Some are very pointed, some are very rounded. These rounded wings tend to be the wings of birds that live inside forests, and they're not very good at crossing wide open cattle pastures, or so the theory goes. So we included this as a measure of dispersal limitation. And then lastly, we wanted to look at nest predation patterns indirectly through traits associated with bird breeding. So first we looked at nest type, and there's different nest types. These are some really beautiful photos that my former lab mate, Ian Osprey, took of Andean bird nests. But the most common nest type in the tropics is an open cup nest. But there's also other types, right? You have these dome nests where they cover the top of the nest with moss and other materials, which in theory should make the nest harder to find. And then you also have cavity nests. Things like woodpeckers build nests in dead trees, and those are really hard to get into. And we thought, well, if there is an effective nest predation, then these guys should be the hardest hit, the cup nesters, and birds that don't have cup nests, that have more protected nests, should do better in fragments. We thought birds that lay more eggs should also do better because they're more likely to have young survive. If a nest is successful, they've put out more babies. And then lastly, we looked at generation length, and that is the amount of time between when a bird is born and when that bird breeds. So if you think about an albatross, a bird that takes, 10, 15, 20 years to breed, that bird is very at risk because it has to survive a very long time to breed. If the generation length is like 1 year or under a year, then a bird can breed very quickly. So even if there are a few successful nests, there's still lots of breeders that appear in fragments. So this was our method to try and indirectly understand the mechanisms. And what do we put in? We actually can get this beta effective patch size from the big fancy Bayesian model. And that's just a way of quantifying, does the bird like fragmentation? Does it not like fragmentation? And we can relate that to these functional traits in a phylogenetic model. So that incorporates a phylogeny, and it says, we know birds are related to each other. So it's taking into account how related bird species are in the model. And we decided to look at this for both the full community So we kicked out the migratory species. I love migratory birds, but they don't breed in cloud forests. So we couldn't use the breeding traits with them. And we looked at just the insectivores. So what do we find? Here we've plotted the different functional traits that I was showing earlier and their effect size. So this is the estimate of the effect size. And this is the confidence interval. So if it overlaps 0, it's not significant, in other words. So I will go into some of the specific details later, but what can we immediately say? Well, here you can see that the functional traits are color-coded by the mechanism. This is the food resources, the nest predation, the light, and then the dispersal. So we actually found support for 3 of our 4 hypotheses: the food, the nest predation, and the light microhabitat. So there's support for multiple simultaneous mechanisms, which is interesting. And then the effect sizes, in other words, how large or small these numbers are about the same. They're more or less equal to 1. And so that's showing that there's not one mechanism in this analysis that's like driving everything. It's a combination, as it often is in ecology, of different mechanisms all operating at the same time. And lastly, there are a few differences, but if we compare the effect sizes for the whole bird community to the insectivores, we see that the direction of effect is mostly the same, even if it's not always significant. And so it doesn't appear that there's something like really special about insectivores that, at least from what we can test, that they're responding super differently, except for this hand wing index, which I will get to in a second. So here I've plotted the phylogeny. So here our birds are grouped by their taxonomic family, again, against how sensitive or not sensitive they are to fragmentation. So I wanted to show that there's some interesting patterns that, for example, in the hummingbirds, certain clades all really love fragmentation, and then others really don't like it, which is kind of intriguing. But I think the bigger result from this was just looking at, we can kind of divide all the bird species here into 3 big categories. So we have the songbirds, the passerines, and that's this whole branch right here, this starting here, and the non-passerines. But when we look within the passerines, we have this group up here that are called sub-Aucine passerines. And why am I giving you a lesson in bird taxonomy? It's because these groups, which we don't have a lot in North America, they are more ancestral songbirds. It's thought that they don't learn their song, for example, that their behavior is a lot more stereotyped. There's a consistent pattern that the sub-Aucine passerines appear to be much more sensitive to fragmentation than the Aucine passerines. So that was intriguing, right? That there seems like there's some sort of taxonomic effect going on here. So the specific results, right? What species are most sensitive to fragmentation? Well, birds with more specialized diets. So again, if you had a score of 1, you were extremely specialized. And this is very crude. We just could look at insects, fruit, seeds. We couldn't look at what type of insect. I would have loved to. But these generalist species tend to not be very area sensitive, right? So they're below 0, meaning that they actually like fragmentation, or there's just not a strong effect. And this is normal. I think most ecologically specialized species are more sensitive to fragmentation globally. Specialists occur at much lower densities, so we would expect this pattern. And 84% of these specialized species are insectivores. So again, that's partly why we think they're declining. There was another study we did on the same landscape that I don't want to get into, but that found that body condition correlated with vegetation structure. In other words, whether a bird was heavier or lighter for its size, that was directly influenced by changes to vegetation structure. And the only way that the bird gets heavier or lighter is if it has more or less to eat. So again, there's strong evidence that changing availability of food is a big mechanism. Second, we found that species that use the canopy and subcanopy were more sensitive than species that live in the understory. And this is really surprising and shocking because in the lowlands, it's always been thought that understory birds are the most sensitive. So what's going on? I think that there's a combination of things, right? Remember, we have these landslide disturbance. We have understory birds that like to live in early successional habitat after landslides. So we actually have some understory birds that like fragmentation. And then the subcanopy birds and canopy birds might be extra vulnerable for a variety of reasons. One is that these subcanopy trees tend to be late successional trees. They might have larger bodied fruits. Again, this is speculation, but the large bodied frugivores in the Andes are all super sensitive to fragmentation. And secondly, the subcanopy has a really high density of epiphytes, mosses, orchids. The Andes are famous for their orchids, but there's all kinds of epiphytes, and epiphytes are super fragmentation sensitive. They do not like edges, and they do not like additional light and less humidity. So there's certain bird species that specialize on eating insects in epiphytes, and they might be declining in fragments because they just don't have as many epiphytes to feed on. Species with larger clutch sizes were less sensitive, right? So species that only had one egg per nest were very sensitive. Species that had lots of eggs, for tropical birds at least, were a lot less sensitive. But we didn't find any effect of generation length or nest type. So the evidence isn't super strong. We know that a lot of high mountain birds have single egg clutches, so that makes them very vulnerable. And we also know that the Andes have a distinct nest predator community from the lowlands that includes more mammals, more birds, fewer reptiles, but there's no monkeys, for example, either. But we really don't know very much about how nest predators respond to fragmentation, especially in the Andes. But one interesting clue is that in a separate study that Juliana published, she found that some of these small, medium-bodied mammals, things like this mustelid, the tyra, crab-eating raccoon, or the jaguarundi, all have higher occupancy in fragments than they do in continuous forests, which is kind of evidence for this mesopredator release hypothesis. But essentially, there's a lot of question marks that we would need to better understand how nest predators change with fragmentation. And species with larger relative eye sizes were more fragmentation sensitive. So again, the forest interior birds with the large eyes do not do well in small fragments. We know that tropical fragments have higher light intensity in the understory because of logging, but also because the edges and stuff tend to promote early successional plant species. So over time, fragments actually they lose a lot of late successional trees and stuff like that. And then it's a cloud forest, right? There's high cloud cover, there's high fog cover. And on a day like when this photo was taken, which is not a black and white photo, but it looks like one, there can be up to an 80% reduction of light in forest understory. So these forest interior cloud forest birds evolved in very dark conditions. So they may be especially unprepared for brighter fragments. And we know that cloud forest birds avoid edges. And one study found that there were effects up to 200 meters inside a fragment of what birds were where. But beyond that, I think there might be an effect on dispersal. I mean, this guy is not going to just walk across a very bright, open cattle pasture because the amount of glare, the amount of light is 10 or 100 times higher than it's used to dealing with. So it's a huge barrier for those species. And lastly, I know I'm running over, so I'll finish up quickly, but we found this very unexpected result, right? Insectivores with more pointed wings were more sensitive. So we thought it would be the opposite, right? These guys are really good at dispersing, so they should be in all the small fragments. But no, it's actually the rounded wing birds do better in fragments, and that was very surprising. So these pointed wing birds include aerial foragers like flycatchers, and they also include species that move from tree to tree. They make long flights in what's been called an aerial lifestyle. So on the one hand, these flycatchers, they have large eyes, they're sensitive to light. They actually they live in the forest, so they like to sally up and pick insects off the undersides of leaves. So they're particularly affected by reductions to vegetation structure. But these other guys, the wood creepers and the woodpeckers, which make these kind of long flights, they don't do that at all. So it's possible that what you see is that these birds are more specialized, and they like to fly long distances from tree to tree. So they use more specialized resources. They have a larger home range, and both of those things mean that in a small fragment, they just can't persist as easily. But it's a bit of a mystery. So what are the conservation implications of all this? As I mentioned earlier, fragment size is really important. Patches that are even 150 hectares in size don't conserve the full bird community, at least in the El Cairo landscape. It seems like the forest interior birds are very sensitive to forest edges, likely due to changes in light and to the vegetation composition. So in other words, it's not just the size of the fragment, it's also the shape of the fragment. The fragment configuration really matters for these cloud forest birds. And maximizing the amount of habitat inside the forest patch maximizes the number of forest birds that can remain. Selective logging, even in continuous forests, removes large diameter trees and it reduces vegetation structure. So it's just it's not an optimal practice for conserving forest birds, even if you're doing it in a very large expanse of forest. And then I think that the changes to light intensity are really important. It seems like a major mechanism, particularly maybe for dispersal. It's not whether you can fly there, it's whether your eyes can tolerate the amount of light in a cattle pasture that may be a major factor for why some of these things can't stay in small fragments. But on the other hand, some Andean birds are clearly adapted to early successional post-landslide landscapes. And there probably was a mosaic of different successional types in a kind of pre-agricultural Andean landscape. But lastly, I think what this highlights when you try and find these functional traits is just that the lack of natural history knowledge hinders bird conservation because we don't know even basic facts about what do these birds eat, what's their territory size, how do they move around. And without that kind of knowledge, it's really hard to effectively conserve them. I will point your attention to this excellent paper that just came out this week or very recently. That was by hundreds of neotropical ornithologists talking about many topics. But one topic that they talk about, you should read it, but is how natural history studies are not considered very sexy. They're not considered very high impact, and they have historically been undervalued in journals. And I think what you see sometimes is the effect of that is that we just don't have the kinds of in-depth natural history studies for the tropics that we have for the temperate zone, because people were doing that in the 19th century. But in the tropics, there's just so much more to discover. So that's my little plea for more natural history studies. And with that, these are the many people I want to acknowledge who this work wouldn't have been possible without. Again, I can't possibly name them all, but I'm super indebted to everyone who helped. Yeah, with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
All right. I'm going to go ahead and open up. We don't need to enter your question in the chat. Just feel free to unmute yourself and hop on and ask a question if you feel like it. And I put the link
Thanks
to
for,
that Suarez paper that Harry just mentioned in the chat, as well as to, I'm probably going to say it incorrectly, but the Serrani Aguas website.
that's right.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
I noticed that one of the characteristics was clutch size, that birds with larger clutch sizes are less sensitive to fragmentation. And I was wondering if there was any kind of like phylogenetic link there, because when I think of birds like that are have large clutch sizes, like galliforms and stuff, I think of them as more open country species. So,
Hmm.
but I'm sure that's oversimplifying it.
I don't know that there's a really strong trend like that in the cloud forest. I think some of the birds that do nest in the cattle pastures probably have larger clutch sizes. Most of these birds have a clutch size of 2, so that definitely influences what you can say. But the model, in theory, is pulling out the phylogenetic element and saying if we disregard the relationships between species, we see this pattern. So in theory, it goes beyond just the family. It's a little unclear. Some of these ones that have really big clutches might actually be communal breeders, but we just don't have very good, include things like toucanets and jays, but we don't have very good data on some of that stuff.
Cool. Do we have any other questions?
I'm going to pop in here. Can we take what you've learned and begin to make restoration strategies? I mean, do we see a link there in how successful we can be in trying to restore some of these habitats, or even if that's possible?
I think that would be the next step. And I'd be very hesitant to give early super prescriptive, this is what you have to do right now, just because it's really hard for us to conserve these birds when we don't know exactly what they eat, what their habitat preferences are. But that said, for the forest interior birds, what seems to be clear is that a lot of them are associated with late successional plants. So it seems to me like trying to restore those plant species in fragments by planting seedlings, and then trying to better connect these patches, with corridors or with more bird-friendly matrix habitat, not wide open cattle pasture, can go a long way as well, because it. I think there's some ideas, but I think. And I would love to explore some of them, but there's so much we don't know. There's so many question marks that I'd be really hesitant to say, this is what you have to do. But fewer edges, more connectivity, and more vegetation structure, so more late successional plants, probably would be a really good starting point.
Great. We have a couple questions in the chat. Katie was wondering how you found your field assistants.
Yeah, I actually had the great luck of working with Juliana and other collaborators in the city of Cali, which is Colombia's 3rd largest city, I believe, and universities there. So it was great. I had an all Colombian field crew who were all young, recently graduated biology majors from Colombian universities, and working with professors down there, people were able to recommend field assistants. So I really lucked out and had a wonderful crew, some of whom are pictured over here.
And Blaine was wondering, how did you account for generation length, given that most birds, especially passerines, at least attempt to breed as yearlings?
Yeah, that's certainly a factor. So I think it's average generation length that was used in 2020. Not only was there a huge study that published that hand wing index, the measure of pointedness for all birds, but there was another huge study that attempted to estimate the average generation length for all birds. So it was very great timing, but we did not estimate that ourselves, and it is somewhat guesswork, right? I mean, they're trying to fill in gaps because there's not good numbers for a lot of these species. So, I mean, I would take those estimates with a grain of salt for sure.